Good afternoon, everybody. We will give this another minute or so that people can join our webinar, and then we will get started. All right, I think we should get going. So my name is Francis Fukuyama. I am a senior fellow at Stanford University, the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. I am the Mosbacher Director of Stanford's Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. And I would like to welcome all of you to this webinar on the Ukrainian fight for democracy in the Black Sea region. Before I introduce our panelists and Ambassador Markarova, I'd just like to mention that my center at Stanford has been very heavily involved in Ukrainian affairs. We have been running a Ukrainian Emerging Leaders program for the last several years that brings young Ukrainian emerging leaders to Stanford University for one academic year, and we're looking forward to welcoming our next class after an interruption due to COVID. I'd like to thank the donors to this program that have made this possible and appreciate very much their support over the years. As an introduction to the panel, we've got quite a number of specific issues we want to talk about. I want to begin by talking about political prisoners and human rights. We are working closely with the Embassy of Ukraine in the United States to advocate on behalf of particular political prisoners held by Russia. And I want to point to one in particular, Osman Arif Mehmetov, who is a 35-year-old Crimean Tatar citizen journalist. He's been a political prisoner since May 15th, 2019. This is another case where a Crimean Tatar journalist has been detained after a search by Russian security officers. Prior to his arrest, his journalism work was respected for the coverage of illegal searches, arrests, and court hearings, as well as for his support of other prisoner activists. He's worked diligently to document the persecution of his colleagues, Belyal Adilov and Timur Ibrahimov. And while in prison, he's continued writing letters to detail how the Russian regime is treating its political prisoners. We very much hope that he and other political prisoners held by Russia illegally will cease soon. So with that, I would like to introduce our panel. Our keynote speaker will be Ambassador Oksana Markarova. She is a Ukrainian politician and current ambassador of Ukraine to the United States. She also served previously as the Minister of Finance in Ukraine. Then our panelist will be Amina Zaporova. She is a Crimean Tatar politician and stateswoman. She's formerly a journalist and currently serves now as the first deputy minister at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Next will be George Kent. He currently serves as Deputy Assistant Secretary in the European and Eurasian Bureau of the U.S. Department of State and oversees policy towards Ukraine, Moldova, Belarus, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. Previously, he was the Deputy Chief of Mission in Kiev. And then finally, we will have Steve Pfeiffer. He is a fellow at the Robert Bosch Academy in Berlin and a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, and was William J. Perry Research Fellow at the Center for International Security and Cooperation here at Stanford's Freeman Spogli Institute. He served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs with responsibilities for Russia and Ukraine. He was ambassador to Ukraine and special assistant to the president and a senior director for Russia. So with that, Ambassador Markarova, The floor is yours. We look forward to your remarks very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. And what an honor and pleasure to be here with true friends and colleagues to discuss this very important and also very timely subject in Ukraine, our fight for democracy. I would like to also thank you, Professor, for being the first one to join our mentoring program, which is very important for us, and agreeing to becoming a mentor for Osman Arif Mehmetov, who is a political prisoner. But this is just the beginning, and we would like to encourage more people to join this fight and help us with not only releasing our prisoners, but also working with them and helping them to go through this during this very difficult period in their lives. It is very symbolic, actually, that we talk today while the NATO leaders are meeting for the summit and discussing many issues and challenges. It is also symbolic that today is the 7th horrible anniversary of downing of the Ukrainian military plane at its approach to Lugansk airport by the Russian-led and sponsored terrorists, which costed us 49 lives of Ukrainian heroes. And it happened in 2014, just a day after our armed forces and National Guard freed the city of Mariupol, which remained Ukrainian and free since then. As a Ukrainian ambassador, of course, I focus on issues and priorities for Ukraine in fighting this aggression and fighting for democracy. Russia not only, illegally annexed and stole our Crimea, not only destroyed parts of Lugansk and Donetsk Oblast, killed thousands of people, tens of thousands, wounded hundreds of thousands, and displaced millions of people in Ukraine. This military aggression also was supplemented with the hybrid aggression, with disinformation campaigns, cyber attacks, but also with interference in the internal transformation and reforms in Ukraine. This war is actually existential for Ukraine, as we all know, and we will not stop together with our allies until Ukraine is whole and until Ukraine can go back and be on the path to develop modern, peaceful, innovative, prosperous European Ukraine. This European Ukraine is very important not only for Ukraine. We all know that the issue is much bigger than just Ukraine. Russia attacked us for only one reason, because in 2014, Ukrainian people once again made civilizational choice to uphold the democratic values and principles, to these principles to build and live by the principles of freedom, but also level playing field in economics. This choice actually Ukrainians repeatedly made in the previous centuries. And repeatedly, this choice has led to the aggression, either from the Russian Empire or the Soviet Union or the present-day Russia. And this choice for us to build Ukraine in Ukraine, this choice for us to eventually join European Union and NATO, as written in our constitution, is something that we, together with others who share these principles, should very much focus on. Because also this choice led to the aggression not only in Ukraine, but in other places, in Georgia, in Moldova, and in Western Europe, in poisoning, interfering in elections, interfering in internal processes. Now, successful Ukraine is a key to stable Europe and Black Sea region. And we're very thankful to the United States leadership and people for being strategic partner number one in this fight. For supporting us and providing so much valued assistance, not only in developing the capabilities of our military, but also in key reforms in rule of law, corruption fight, economic transformation of Ukraine. The recent sanctions also, and the strong response from the United States and other European allies stopped Russia from advancing from the recent build-up, and we do hope that the sanction policy will continue until the Russia will change their behavior and start pulling out from Ukraine. Now, I'm sure that together here we are with same people who share all these values and who are fighting together with us. So with that, I would like to wish everyone a great event and productive discussion. And I myself look forward very much to listening to our esteemed panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Markarova. And so with that, Actually, maybe I can just insert a little comment of my own. The reason that we at Stanford got so involved with Ukrainian affairs was for exactly the reason that you pointed out, that this is really the frontline struggle for democracy around the world. And it's our belief that if Ukraine does not succeed as a democracy, then democracy is not going to succeed anywhere else in the former communist world. And so it is an extremely important common struggle that makes a big difference to all of us. So with that, we will turn to our panel. So we will begin with Emina Japarova. So please go ahead and make your remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, dear Francis. The screen is all mine. So dear colleagues, distinguished audience, it is really a great pleasure to participate in today's video conference and to discuss something that is of a great importance for my country and for myself personally, as I used to live in Crimea before the events of 2014 happened. And of course, I survived and still keep on living through this pain of this feeling that my homeland is lost, but there is also a very great impetus for this fight to get Crimea back. And I'm also very thankful to the organizers and especially in particular for the Professor Fukuyama for staying focused on this issue of Crimea, and namely the citizen journalist of Crimean Tatar origin, Osman Arif Mehmetov. Before I start briefing the panelists on the situation in Crimea, with particular attention to the human rights violation and the Crimea Platform Initiative, which is the most recent Ukrainian foreign policy flagship project, I'm honored to state that the United States contributed significantly to the attempt to thwart Russia's plans to legitimize its attempted annexation of Crimea on the international arena. But we still, however, we still have a feeling and need to enhance the efforts on the global democratic community in formulating and solidifying and consolidating the response to Russia's continuous attempted escalation, as the situation in Crimea continues to deteriorate in all spheres, including the unprecedented militarization of the peninsula. Since the beginning of the occupation, Moscow has more than tripled its military presence in the peninsula, with all of the military components having been modernized and upgraded. Along with the ongoing military buildup in violation of international law and under the pretext of military exercises, Russia closed and restricted for half a year the part of the Black Sea close to the Kerch Strait and the passage to the Sea of Azov for the foreign and military vessels. And we believe that this has been done not only to demonstrate its power and dominance, but also to ruin Ukraine's trade and economic relations with partners. And of course, the situation with the human rights in Crimea is extremely worrying. Over 120 citizens of Ukraine remain illegally detained under politically motivated charges in Crimea and Russia. Most of them, and unfortunately the majority of the political detainees, are Crimean Tatars, and freedom of speech is a taboo in Crimea. Just several telling examples. In March this year, Vladislav Yusupenko, a freelancer for Radio Free Europe, was detained in Crimea under bogus charges. Only a month after his arrest, independent lawyers were allowed to work on the case. Despite his statement at the court hearings on torture by Russian law enforcement bodies, the court ignored his testimonies and extended his arrest. On 20th of April 2021, the Russian occupation authorities in Crimea fined the chief editor of the Crimean Tatar newspaper Kırım, Bekir Mamutov, who is a friend of mine, for publishing the UN Secretary General's report that mentioned the Crimean Tatar Mejlis, which is a self-governing institution. Having expelled independent media from the peninsula, the occupation authorities started persecuting those activists who took the role of journalists and started filling up the vacuum and the loopholes of the objective and unbiased coverage of the situation in the occupied peninsula. Alternative sources of information became inaccessible as Ukrainian TV and radio programs are blocked and internet traffic is strictly monitored. Currently, we have 8 citizen journalists behind bars and 1 is under house arrest. Those are Server Mustafayev, Timur Ibragimov, Marlen Asanov, Siran Saliyev, Rimzi Bekirov, Ruslan Suleimanov, Osman Arif Mehmetov, Rustem Sheikh Aliyev, and Ahmed Suleimanov. Having spoken to previously released prisoners, I learned that the international publicity of their cases was indeed among most effective tools to prevent torture and other abuses by Russian police and FSB. And I often refer to this story when I had a phone conversation with Nariman Mamedinov. He was one of the civil and citizen journalists detained. He spent 3 years behind bars for the video clip about Islam that he produced in 2013, half a year before the occupation started. And when he was released, I talked with him on the phone and he said that the only reason why he was not tortured was the publicity of his case. Another prominent Ukrainian citizen, Igor Kozlovsky, he said that he spent months in the basements of Donbass. He said that his tortures stopped when the US ambassador, Marie Yovanovitch, started to articulate his case. So I think that publicity is something that is a very practical instrument of protecting and safeguarding those political prisoners and Ukrainian citizens who remain living under occupation. And this is why we have launched a public mentoring campaign to support the imprisoned journalists and raise international public awareness of the situation with the suppression of freedom of speech in Crimea. And in this regard, we are sincerely grateful, and I'm sincerely grateful to Professor Fukuyama, who has joined this initiative and launched the public campaign in support of Ukrainian political prisoner Osman Arif Mehmetov. Regretfully, human rights violations do not end with suppression of media. The occupation authorities are particularly aggressive towards indigenous people of Crimea, Crimean Tatars. Most notably, they target Crimean Tatar representative bodies. Despite the order of the ICJ dated 2017, the Majlis of Crimean Tatar people remains banned. On 1st of June 2021, the so-called Supreme Court of Crimea sentenced in absentia to imprisonment the chairman of the Majlis of the Crimean Tatar people, Mr. Rifat Chubarov, to 6 years and imposed a fine of 200,000 rubles. And Rifat Chubarov is accused of organizing mass riots on 26th of February 2014 near the Crimean parliament. To consolidate and strengthen this international response to Russia's occupation and the whole bunch of the consequences that we can see on an everyday basis, we have initiated the establishment of the Crimea Platform, which is a multi-layer international format that will be officially launched during the inaugural summit in Kiev. That will take place August 23rd. And now we're working on the scenario and on the documents that will be adopted during the summit and on the invitations of the leaders who we believe will consolidate our effort. On the way here to the final goal, the occupation of Crimea, we will move along the 5 priority tracks. These are non-recognition policy, effectiveness of sanctions, security and freedom of navigation, protecting human rights and international humanitarian law, and mitigating the negative consequences of occupation to economy and environment. At the same time, the concept of the platform encompasses much wider aspects than just Ukrainian territorial integrity. The support of the platform by the international community will send a very strong and powerful message to protect international law as such, to uphold inviolability of internationally recognized borders, and to stand up for our common values, human rights, and fundamental freedoms. I will give more detailed explanation about our plans for the human rights track of the Crimea platform as the most relevant to today's topic and discussion. We envisage to first introduce a mechanism of prompt and coordinated reaction of states and international organizations to serious human rights violations, ensure the high level of publicity for cases of gross human rights violations as mean of protection of victims and prevention of further violations, enhance monitoring of the situation vis-a-vis gross violations of human rights and norms of international humanitarian law, including with a view to provide the political decision makers with the relevant information on the organizers and perpetrators of these crimes, in order to apply personal sanctions against these people. Devise ways to protect cultural heritage sites located in the temporarily occupied Crimea using the UNESCO tools and mechanisms. And at the Crimea Platform Summit, we also plan to adopt the ambitious declaration that is expected to outline the international policy on Crimea. And of course, we are grateful to those states which have already confirmed their participation, including the United States. The US stressed publicly on numerous occasions that they will be represented on the high level. So looking forward to welcome our American guests here in Kiev. And also we have already gathered the core of the Crimea platform, the occupation coalition, and the number of participants constantly grows. It is our hope that together we will be able not only to save Crimea from human rights sufferings, but also to return it to Ukraine by peaceful means, because we are committed to these instruments, by political and diplomatic instruments, but also protect the rules-based order and respect for human rights globally. Thank you for your attention, Sahomos.
Thank you very much, Ms. Shaparova. So I should note that if you have questions for any of the panelists, please click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we will put them in the queue. I think it's really important. The Crimean platform is very important as a means of reminding the world that this exists. I think what the Russians are doing is hoping that as time goes on, people will simply forget that its troops are sitting on the territory of neighboring countries, and they're doing this in Georgia and Moldova as we speak. And it's important not to forget that that is happening either. So thank you very much, and we will proceed now to George Kent. George, please go ahead.
Thanks, Dr. Fukuyama. Greetings, salam, privyet from Cambridge, Massachusetts, home of another great institution of learning with a Ukraine-focused program. It's an honor to join my longtime friends and colleagues, including Emine, Oksana, and Ambassador Pfeiffer, who will speak after me, to discuss the developments in the Black Sea, particularly Ukraine's movement towards more democratic institutions, Russia's occupation of Crimea, and the ongoing aggression in eastern Ukraine. US policy reaffirms, in short, the soccer jerseys worn by Ukraine's national team this week, competing in the Euro 2020 tournament. Crimea is Ukraine. And I'd like to emphasize some of the themes that Emine just laid out on behalf of the Ukrainian government, on behalf of the US government, touching on both systemic security as well as individual human rights implications of the regional developments. Systemically, Russia's seizure of Crimea in 2014 was one of the most brazen affronts to the international order in modern memory. A permanent member of the UN Security Council invaded and occupied a neighbor without provocation. In addition to the violation of Ukrainian sovereignty and the severe blow to regional security in the Black Sea region and Europe more generally, the occupation has been imposing an ongoing and tremendous human cost. And Emine very rightly laid out some of the individual names of individuals who have stood up for the values that we all embrace and have paid a personal cost. And those abuses by Russia in Crimea are extensive and well documented. This is clear despite Russia's refusal to allow human rights monitors, whether from the UN or the OSCE monitoring missions in Ukraine, access to the peninsula. The abuses have included extrajudicial killings, disappearances, reported torture, politically motivated detentions, and the targeting of religious and ethnic minorities. This climate of fear and the atomization of society is much worse than in Russia itself. As Ukraine moves forward, Russia and Crimea move in reverse. The United States remains deeply concerned about the detention of more than 100 political prisoners from Crimea, many of whom, as M&A described, are Crimean Tatars, whose only crime is voicing their opposition to occupation, sometimes as simply as flying a Ukrainian flag or liking somebody else's Facebook post. Occupation authorities regularly detain and impose prison sentences on anyone who objects to the occupation. They particularly target Crimean Tatars, ethnic Ukrainians, and other ethnic and religious minorities. And I'd like to just mention a little bit on that latter element, building on what M&A said. For instance, Russia deems the Crimean Tatar Mejlis, a civil society organization, self-governing institution, as a terrorist organization. Others are targeted and accused of being members of Hizb ut-Tahrir or the Jehovah's Witnesses, groups that are legal in Ukraine, but have been labeled extremist under Russian law. The continuous and systemic efforts of Russian occupation authorities to expel the Orthodox Church of Ukraine from the peninsula, including the seizure of church property, the cathedral in Simferopol, and the intimidation of the church's priests and parishioners, are well documented and again should be unacceptable to anyone. Occupation authorities have also conscripted nearly 30,000 Crimean residents into the Russian armed forces and launched criminal cases against those who evade the draft. Some of these Ukrainian citizens have been reportedly assigned to units connected to the Russia-led conflict in eastern Ukraine, where they would then be forced to fight against their countrymen on their own territory. Crimeans who have taken the courageous step to expose those abuses and protest the occupation face lengthy prison sentences, leaving behind families and frightened communities. Nearly 200 Crimean children are growing up without their fathers, languishing in prisons in Russia and Russia-controlled facilities in Crimea on politically motivated charges. For our part, we call on Russia to end the human rights abuses and release all Ukrainians it unjustly holds. The raiding of mosques, churches, and homes should stop. Russia should respect the role of independent media and the fundamental freedoms enshrined in the UN Declaration of Human Rights and the OSCE charters to which it belongs. It is time to stop handing down prison sentences to those who speak out against occupation. While the human cost of occupation cannot be overstated, and we've tried to describe it initially here, Russia's accelerating militarization of Crimea also has significant regional security implications, and M&A started talking about a number of them. Russia uses its foothold in Crimea to project power in the Black Sea, the Mediterranean Sea, and the Middle East, threatening regional security in a way that extends beyond Ukrainians' borders. Russia has moved nuclear-capable aircraft and missiles, weapons and ammunition into Crimea, and uses the peninsula to deny naval access to the Black Sea, the Sea of Azov, and the Kerch Strait. The Navy harasses commercial shipping vessels and mounts provocations against Ukrainian and other foreign government vessels. In a December 2020 resolution, the UN General Assembly condemned the militarization of Crimea. Today, we reiterate the UN's call for Russia to end its occupation of Crimea and withdraw forces from Ukraine. The occupation of Crimea has now gone on for more than 7 years. We cannot and should not allow the violations of a rule-based international order to become normalized, again, as M&A mentioned before. And in that case, the United States does very much welcome the Ukrainian initiative to launch the Crimea platform this August as a forum to systemically coordinate approaches on Crimea and work together to end the occupation and to reintegrate all Crimeans into Ukrainian society. Ambassador Markarova mentioned and referenced the gathering of leaders of NATO. And as the leaders of NATO member countries gather together for a summit to advance transatlantic unity of effort, it's a reminder that Black Sea littoral states, which include NATO members Romania, Bulgaria, and Turkey, and partners like Ukraine and Georgia, can do more together to promote freedom of navigation and maritime cooperation, working with committed partners like the United States, the United Kingdom, and other maritime members of the alliance. So let me close by reiterating the steadfast U.S. commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. We do not, nor will we ever, recognize Russia's purported annexation of Crimea. Simply put, Crimea is Ukraine. The United States will work with allies and partners to continue to counter the Kremlin's campaign to destabilize Ukraine and thwart aspirations for democratic development and closer ties to Europe. We strongly reaffirm our support for Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. And we look forward to continuing to work with Ukraine and our allies and partners through the Crimean platform, enhancing regional cooperative security efforts. Thank you all, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much, George. And now we'll turn to Steve Pifer.
Thanks, Frank. I'll try to keep my comments short because I think Ambassador Markarova, Deputy Minister Japarova, and Deputy Assistant Secretary Kent have already covered the main questions. But let me just say, Russia's been at war with Ukraine now for more than 7 years. And the focus in Kyiv and in the West has been on trying to resolve that conflict between Ukrainian forces and Russian proxy forces in Donbass. And that's understandable because that's the place where Ukrainians are dying on a regular basis. But it's also important that we not lose sight of Crimea, which sometimes slips into the background. And it's important not to lose sight of Russia's illegal seizure of Crimea, in which Russia used military force to seize and annex the territory of a neighboring state. And that's a blatant assault on the principles that have guided post-World War II Europe. It's a violation of Russia's commitments under the Helsinki Final Act and subsequent OSCE documents, a violation of Russia's commitments under the Budapest Memorandum, and a violation of Russia's commitments in multiple agreements with Ukraine. Now, it's hard to see restoration of democracy and a better human rights situation in Crimea as long as Crimea remains occupied by Russia. Because Russia's history over the last 30 years on democracy has not been a positive one. Certainly there were some aspects of democracy in the chaotic 1990s, but when Vladimir Putin came to the presidency, there was a move to assert greater control and assert a more authoritarian political structure. So you saw terms such as managed democracy and sovereign democracy, in which Russia maintained the facade of democracy, but it wasn't real. A systemic opposition, such as the Liberal Democratic Party, which is a party that's neither liberal nor democratic, was permitted, and they were the opposition party, but they always agreed with the Kremlin on key issues that were of importance to the Russian leadership. And what we've seen in Russia over the last year and a half, 2 years, is that mask is coming off. There now is clearly no tolerance for non-systemic opposition. We've seen that with the closure of Alexei Navalny's organization, no tolerance for opposition media or non-governmental organizations, be they Russian or foreign. And in many ways, what you're seeing going on within Russia looks like a return to Soviet times. And in some ways, the Crimean Tatars, they know this because Crimea, unfortunately, has been in the head of the game in terms of this restoration of internal repression within Russia. Now, the restoration of Ukrainian sovereignty over Crimea would mean the return to Crimea of a better democratic situation and human rights. But unfortunately, it's difficult to see how that occurs. Russia took Crimea not just because of differences between Ukraine and Russia, or geopolitics, or baseless Kremlin claims about the treatment of ethnic Russians, or for concerns about the Black Sea Fleet or military security. It was also very much a matter of Russian domestic politics and regime legitimacy. The seizure of Crimea, unfortunately, was popular with the Russian public, and that was used by Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin. In the early 2000s, Mr. Putin justified regime legitimacy on the basis of economics. And I recall when I was still in government before I retired in 2004, going to Moscow, and Russians would say, Vladimir Putin has this informal social compact with us in which we understand we're not going to have much of a political voice, but we will see a growing economy, growing incomes, rising living standards. And in those first 8 years, in 2000 and 2008, Mr. Putin was lucky, the price of oil was up, and the Russian economy grew at 5 to 7% a year, and he delivered. But when he came back to the presidency in 2012, the economic situation was much more grim. He faced a stagnant economy, and decisions that he's made in the past and continue to make ensure that economy is going to remain stagnant in the future, if not go into economic decline. And so for the last 9 years, what you've seen is Mr. Putin justify regime legitimacy, not on the basis of economics, but on themes such as Russian nationalism and Russia's a great power and Russia reasserting its place in the world. And quite frankly, seizing Crimea played well into that narrative. And so bearing in mind this domestic political factor, it complicates this issue between Kyiv and Moscow. And the question now is, can Ukraine muster the political, diplomatic, economic, and military leverage to secure the restoration of Ukrainian sovereignty over Crimea? And I think the honest answer, unfortunately, has to be no. The West could help with additional sanctions that might change the Russians' cost-benefit calculation. But while, for example, the European Union has maintained sanctions since 2014, and that's something I would not have predicted, and I think many in America would not have predicted, it's hard to see Europe going to additional sanctions. And then the other tools that might alter that calculation in the Kremlin are hard to see. So it's difficult to see how you reverse the illegal seizure of Crimea in the near term. But let me go back a little bit to the 2014 and the referendum that was conducted after the Russian military occupied Crimea. The referendum was bogus. It had two choices. Either you voted to join Russia, or you voted for a restoration of the early 1990s Crimean constitution, which in effect made Crimea practically an independent state. If you were happy with Crimea being a part of Ukraine under the constitutional arrangements in 2014, the referendum gave you no box to check. Also, the reported numbers in the referendum had no credibility whatsoever. But I do think we have to concede that there was some portion of the Crimean population. We're not going to know what that was. Certainly, we don't accept the numbers that were put out by the Russians, but there was some portion of the Crimean population that did vote to join Russia. And I suspect for many of them, the motivating factor was the belief that their economic life would be better off as part of Russia than Ukraine. Because in 2014, gross domestic product per capita in Russia was significantly better than in Ukraine. Now, I think in Crimea, they've since learned the limits on what Russia is prepared to do economically, but that's with hindsight. But it does, to me, suggest one way that Ukraine might secure the restoration of sovereignty over Crimea in the longer term, and that is if Ukraine becomes a full success story. Ukraine has already demonstrated it knows how to do democracy. There are real politics in Kyiv, the clash of interests, it's pluralistic. And just one factor I would cite is, since Ukraine regained independence, there have been 6 presidential elections. In 4 of those 6 elections, the incumbent ran for re-election. In 3 of those 4 elections, the incumbent lost. No one else in the post-Soviet space has a democratic record to match that. But unfortunately, Ukraine has not made parallel progress at the same level on its economic reform. It has yet to achieve that critical mass of economic reforms and anti-corruption measures that would allow the realization of Ukraine's economic potential. Now, if Ukraine can build that kind of successful state, match a democracy with a growing economy, with rising wages, rising living standards, that's going to have some real payoffs in addition to the economic benefits to the Ukrainian people. It'll mean a Ukrainian state that's more resilient to Russian pressure. It'll also increase the prospects that Ukraine could hope to enter the European Union. And that kind of successful Ukraine terrifies the Kremlin, because what the Kremlin fears is a successful, democratic, economically growing Ukraine on its western border, because that's going to lead Russians to ask why they can't have the same political voice that Ukrainians have. But that kind of Ukraine, if Ukraine can build that kind of success, should also worry the Kremlin for another reason. And as it might cause the people in Crimea to conclude that not only their political life, but their economic future might be better back as part of Ukraine. And that could introduce a new factor that could change the game board. But that's a long-term point. It's dependent on the Ukrainian government making some tough reform decisions. And for now, we're going to have to work, Ukraine and its friends, to reiterate the point that, in fact, Crimea is Ukraine. The West needs to continue the non-recognition policy. This is something we know very well how to do. We did it for 5 decades with regards to the Baltic states. We need to sustain the Crimean-related sanctions. We need to continue military support for Ukraine, including importantly military visits to the Black Sea region, both by NATO member warships, but also by NATO overflights. And we need to use venues such as the Crimean platform to remind the world of Crimea's occupied status. And while it may be the prognosis now for an early return of Crimea to Ukrainian sovereignty, may not be that bright, I think it's useful to recall the case of the Baltics. The United States and others did not recognize the Baltics incorporation of the Soviet Union. And it did not seem possible that they could ever regain their independence in the 1950s or the 1960s or the 1970s or the 1980s, and then it happened. Crimea is Ukraine, and I think there's a possibility that Crimea can be restored to Ukrainian sovereignty, and we need to keep working towards that end. And thanks for having me. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much to Ambassador Markarova and all of our panelists. Maybe I could just insert a little bit, since nobody else talked about the 3 Cs initiative. This is something I find extremely fascinating because Russia is not the only authoritarian power that has been playing in this region. China, through its Belt and Road Initiative, has made very great inroads into Eastern Europe through the 17+1 process. And the 3 Cs initiative that's been pushed by Poland and Romania is really fascinating because really what it seeks to do is recognize that there's a common interest on a north-south axis from the Baltic states all the way down through Romania and Bulgaria, and then into Ukraine and Georgia in maintaining democracy. Most of the infrastructure investment done by China has been east-west because they want to get their goods from the Far East into Europe. But the idea of actually having an economic community built around these countries that border on the Adriatic, the Baltic, and the Black Seas is a really important one. I don't need to say that this also has some military implications because better communications routes north-south will also facilitate NATO's ability to support all of those frontline states that may in the future be facing Russian military aggression. So I'd be curious to get views of the other panelists on what the future of that initiative may. I understand that Ukraine has already expressed support and interest for it. So let me begin. I would like to remind everybody that if they have questions for any of the panelists, please put them in the Q&A. We already have a couple. So one is how you would compare the occupation of Crimea to Russia's occupations of other territories in Georgia and Moldova in the Donbass. So anyone that would like to take that? And I guess we actually had 2 questions from the same person. So the second one has to do with another issue that has not been spoken of yet, which is really Nord Stream 2. And the question is, how will Ukraine diversify its energy resources to deal with the challenges that will be posed if this pipeline comes on board? So the floor is open. Ambassador, would you like to talk on any of those subjects?
Well, let me maybe briefly touch upon the Nord Stream 2, and then I will leave the colleagues to talk about others. I mean, the Nord Stream 2, as we all know and agree, is not just the energy issue. It's not a question about supplying Ukraine or Europe with gas. It's one of the weapons that Russia uses, not only against Ukraine, but also potentially against the region. So it's a question of not only energy diversification, but it's also a question about security first and foremost. So we're very thankful for the United States and other allies for the sanctions. All these years, we believe the sanctions have been very successful. We know that it was sanctions that delayed the project, but also the sanctions that allowed us to sign the agreement that we do have with Russia right now for the transit. Now, there are many issues with the Nord Stream 2, in addition to security and geopolitical. There are a lot of concerns related with climate change and environmental issue, which we hear more and more now. There are a lot of concerns related to the international anti-money laundering and financial monitoring issues with that. So in Ukraine, we will be pursuing, and we are pursuing all of them, and we are working closely with all of our allies to continue to stop that project. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Anybody else on the panel?
Yeah, I'll chime in on the conflicts question, because I'm the U.S. representative to the Transnistrian 5+2 process and was just in Transnistria, Moldova 10 days ago. The OSCE plays a critical role in all of the so-called frozen conflicts or active conflicts. Not all of them are frozen, whether it's Transnistria, Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Nagorno-Karabakh, and even Donbass. And each process has a different name. I think Crimea is different in the sense that there is no mechanism, certainly not from the OSCE, and it's the one place where Russia has formally annexed or claimed to have annexed and treats the territory as integral to and subject to Russian law. The status of South Ossetia and Abkhazia is also slightly different. Russian troops are in the territories. If those of us who have gone to the line of contact from Georgia-administered territory and looked across into, for instance, South Ossetia, the troops staring at us back through binoculars are wearing Russian uniforms. It's very clearly Russian border troops, but they treat them as independent statelets, and they even have a series of countries, I think 4 countries, including Nicaragua and Nauru, who have formally recognized the independence of the statelets, but no one else does, and certainly the rest of the world considers it integral part of Georgian territory. And in that respect, although some people have feared the Abkhazization, South Ossetization of Donetsk and Luhansk occupied territories with proxy leaders, the Russians have not yet gone that far. And then Karabakh is its own situation where there are now, for the first time in 30 years, Russian peacekeepers de facto in charge of a portion of Karabakhi territory. And so I think each situation is different, but I think certain common themes are apparent. And it struck me as I was sitting with my Russian and Ukrainian colleagues in the meetings in Chisinau and Moldova and Tiraspol, that even the language we use is different. The Russian ambassador at large continually used the verbal noun uregulирование, the regulation of a conflict, whereas these mechanisms were set up in the case of Transnistria 30 years ago to solve the conflict and to restore sovereignty in the case of Moldova with a special status for Transnistria. And the Ukrainian ambassador at large was using the language of solving conflict. Let's find a final settlement. And I think that has always been the purpose of these conflict resolution mechanisms, to restore territorial integrity and sovereignty and control, and sometimes, in some cases, with special conditions. And it struck me that, whether it's been the Transnistrian conflict, which dates back to 91-92, whether it's the Karabakh conflict, Minsk Group process that has dated back since 95-96, there we're looking to resolve with a final status for Nagorno-Karabakh based on the Madrid principles. Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov was quoted last week to talk about wanting only to focus on confidence-building mechanisms and not to talk about the final settlement. So the language was very similar to what I heard in Tiraspol the week prior. And I think it's a reminder that the Russian approach is not to solve these conflicts, but to use them as leverage and prevent the countries from moving westward. I'll turn it back over to the panel.
Okay. Emine, did you have a comment?
Yes, I raised my hand. Thank you. Thank you, Francis. just following the line that George already said, that of course every case is different, but there are certain features that are in common if we speak about the occupied territories, especially with regards to Georgia and Ukraine. I would say that there is one common template of the attempt to legitimize the situation. And if you want to find out what is the prosperous future of Donbass or other geopolitical projects of Russia, we can go and check the situation in South Ossetia and Abkhazia. So I think that this is something that can definitely demonstrate and depict what is the future of those other projects, the most recent ones. There are some issues that Russia is trying to follow with regards to its geopolitical projects. I think it's a manifestation of its glory and dominance, of its imperialistic attitudes, I would say. Then, of course, Ambassador Pfeiffer, in his speech, he said that Russia is very much scared of prosperous, strong, economically strong Ukraine on its border. I think it's not only about Ukraine, it's about the whole post-Soviet countries, as far as Russia is trying to launch the chain of these gray zones and unstable economies and countries with regards to other countries. Of course, the other thing that is Russia trying to demonstrate is the blocking of EU and NATO expansion and the language of threatening and blackmail about the possible membership of Georgia and Ukraine to NATO and EU is another argument that we have to keep in mind. And I would say that the frozen conflicts are the ones that we can see in South Ossetia, in Georgia and Ukraine, are the so-called and relative low-cost attitude for Russia. While it does not need to invest that much money by having a classical, let's say, war, but in a low-cost attitude to control the territories, to crack the democracy, to make the countries unstable. And I think that this is something that can be also in common if we describe the occupied territories.
Thank you. Steve, do you have any comments?
Yeah, let me comment briefly on both questions. First of all, I agree. I mean, the Russian strategy towards Crimea, Donbass, South Ossetia, Abkhazia, Transnistria, it's not about settlement, it's about destabilization. For reasons that are hard for me to understand, Moscow has come to a conclusion that having unstable neighbors is somehow a good thing, but I think it's about asserting Russian leverage in those countries. And I also think it goes to the deputy minister's point, which is the Russians believe that by occupying parts of Ukraine and Moldova and Georgia, that will be a hindrance to those countries' desires to draw closer to NATO and the European Union. And they may have a point. I think for a number of NATO members, it's a serious question. You know, if we take Ukraine in tomorrow, you know, is NATO then not at war with Russia over Crimea and Donbass? And I think that's part of the Russian calculation. So again, it's going to make it very hard to resolve these questions. On Nord Stream 2, let me say, I think it's entirely a geopolitical project. One thing that we're going to see, particularly as it looks like now, the European consumption of natural gas is expected to be stagnant through 2030, and then it's likely to decline. And so you're going to have a lot of pipelines with very little gas with not enough gas, a lot of excess capacity. So that, to my mind, makes clear the point, this is a geopolitical project. And I understand the US government's right to oppose it, but I also understand the US government not wanting to invoke sanctions that could turn the debate between one side, Russia, and everybody else over Nord Stream 2, not making that a debate then between the US government and Germany and the US government and the European Union. And I think invocation of American sanctions that would target German and European companies would be a pretty difficult problem in transatlantic relations. And if managed badly enough, might even have an impact of undoing the sanctions we've maintained for the last 7 years against Russia because of Russia's seizure of Crimea and Russia's activities in Donbass. So I think the question is, and it still remains to be seen whether the Germans are prepared to play the proper role on this, is that if Nord Stream 2 is going to be completed, and I think that's likely to happen fairly soon. There's an incentive, quite frankly, in Berlin to get this done before September, because on September 26th, the Germans have their federal elections. And while you don't exactly know what the coalition will look like after that election, it's a virtual certainty that the Greens Party, which is the party in Germany that's most adamantly opposed to Nord Stream 2, they will be part of that government. And I think that's created this incentive to get the pipelines done this summer. But the question then becomes is, except if that's going to happen, Ukraine is going to be the biggest loser. Are there things that the Germans could do that would offer some kind of a benefit to Ukraine? For example, extend the current contract, which requires that Gazprom put 40 billion cubic meters of gas per year through Ukrainian pipelines through 2024. Or perhaps could some European companies say, we're going to buy gas from Russia, but we're going to take delivery of that gas on the Russian-Ukrainian border. That's when we'll assume ownership. And then we, those companies, will then pay the transit cost to Ukraine to move. There are things that Europe could do that would cushion the blow when Nord Stream 2 comes online. And I think just as the United States, I believe in the end, was sensitive to German concerns, I hope Germany will now be sensitive to US concerns and Ukraine's requirements.
Okay, thank you very much. There's another question about the closing of the 3 Medvedchuk channels. And the question is directed to the American participants in particular about whether, although we may agree on the purpose of doing that, whether the means that were undertaken to do that raise some questions. Obviously about freedom of speech and the like. Anyone want to take that on?
I think I'll since I'm, the U.S. government representative, I can speak several words, and Steve, as a former government representative now working at Stanford, can add. I think the Russian efforts to weaponize information through the form of disinformation, propaganda, and as well as attacks using cyber, energy. There are lots of different ways that Russia has tools to undermine Ukraine and also attack Western institutions, is a factor as much as the principle of supporting freedom of the media. And I think the challenge, comes when a legitimate form and institution and principle as freedom of the media is intentionally weaponized, essentially to turn the elements of democracy against itself. And that is something I think all democracies that value and cherish freedom of expression and the strength of institutions struggle with. And there's a debate in the US, should Russia Today and Sputnik be allowed to broadcast as Radio Free Europe is shut down in Russia. And I think what Ukraine has faced is platforms that were undermining the integrity of the Ukrainian state and basically broadcasting hate speech in some respects, and whether those elements, which were funded either through illicit funds from the occupied territories, Donetsk, Luhansk, or funded directly from Russia, had the right to retain their broadcast license. And so I think people can debate about what the standards are to retain a broadcast license. And the US does stand up for the rights of freedom of the media. And I think M&A probably remembers at one time at 11 o'clock at night on a Friday, I was instructed to demarche her about the shutdown of Dozhd TV, or the loss of its broadcast license in Ukraine, because they affirmed from their perspective that Crimea was part of Russia. And Dozhd faced a choice. Did they respect Russian law or Ukrainian law? And it's a Russian media property, and they chose to embrace the illegal Russian claim on Crimea and therefore violated Ukrainian law. So I delivered our concerns about the protest against shutting down of what is in the Russian context considered a liberal media environment. And yet that liberal, in the Russian context, media property denied Ukrainians sovereignty over Ukraine. It's a reminder that one Ukrainian intellectual in the 1890s said the concept of Russian liberalism ends on the question of Ukraine. And one might argue that 130 years later is as true now as it was then. But there's no question that that is, we have two principles here that we both support: freedom of media, countering Russian disinformation. A lot of these efforts to weaponize institutions and opportunities are done intentionally, and they do provide these sorts of moments of our principles sometimes going against each other. And there's no easy answer, but I think we do recognize the right of every sovereign country to the right of self-defense. And the idea of a country at war weaponizing broadcast TV and attacking the country is something that I think average individuals can understand. You didn't have Nazi propaganda broadcast on CBS during World War II as a comparator. Over to others.
Yeah, let me just add briefly. I think countries have to be very careful, particularly if they embrace democratic values. They have to be careful about closing down media outlets. But in this case, Ukraine's actions were fully justified, as Deputy Assistant Secretary Kent said. The Russians, with the assistance of Mr. Medvedchuk, had weaponized those channels against Ukraine, and Ukraine could not be expected to allow them to continue. I would just briefly note that few things have been more ironic when one watches the spokesperson of the Russian Foreign Ministry, who says lots of interesting things, but when she comes out and expresses concern about media freedom in Ukraine, as Russia shuts down media outlets right and left with no parallel concerns.
Yeah, if I could just add a little to that. We are used to thinking about freedom of the press in terms of government control over the media, but it seems to me in much of the former communist world, you have another big threat to freedom of speech, which is basically oligarchic control that oftentimes is actually just a cover for state control. So for example, in Hungary, Viktor Orban has managed to put a lot of the legacy Hungarian media under control of people that are very close to him and his Fidesz party. And in a way, Ukraine is the furthest along in this process, where basically all of the big media channels are owned by a different oligarch. And that constitutes not necessarily a state threat to freedom of the press, but it is a real threat to democracy, because the press is not supposed to represent the interests of a kind of thin layer of very rich individuals. It is supposed to be a place for much more open access by citizens. I think that issue is a lot more complicated than the principles that we might otherwise have brought to bear. So I would like to open another issue, which has to do with the G7 summit that just occurred, and then President Biden's meeting on Wednesday with President Putin. I would like to get a readout from our speakers about what they thought the results of the summit were, and what their expectations, hopes, and fears for the bilateral meeting are going to be. So anyone, please. Yes, please.
Just very
Deputy
briefly.
Minister.
Yeah, just very briefly, following the line of Minister Kuleba, who said that our problem and expectation lays within two issues, which is energy security and the project Nord Stream 2, which is really purely a geopolitical project. And of course, we cannot support these kind of projects which are against energy security of Ukraine. And the other is, again, what is the prospect and the future of Ukraine with regards to its aspiration of NATO enlargement. This is something that, and just recently, after the NATO summit, the joint statement that came out of this summit, some of the paragraphs that covered Ukraine clearly said that there was a Bucharest summit decision of 2008, which which directly said that membership action plan should be provided to Ukraine as an instrument of its perspective and its aspiration. So I think this is yet another issue that we are very much focused on, and of course we expect support to this aspiration. So I think it's about NATO enlargement, energy security, and of course territorial integrity. These are the occupied territories, which is 7% of the territory of Ukraine, Donbas and Crimea. And some of the numbers Ambassador Markarova has already mentioned, with thousands of Ukrainians dead and wounded within the war. And those not only classic mechanisms of Russia's influence in the occupied territories, which are forcible passportization, change of demography, and hybrid intentions to legitimize its presence, but also the other, again, hybrid instruments that Russia is actively involving to crack Ukraine, not only informationally, but also within its resilience instruments. Thank you.
Right, could I?
Please go ahead.
Let me talk about Biden-Putin, but first, just a couple points on the membership action plan for Ukraine. First of all, I thought the language that came out of today's NATO summit was actually quite positive for Ukraine. But I guess I would make 2 points about the membership action plan, which I suspect Ukraine is not going to get in the near term. Point number one is Ukraine can take a membership action plan, write it, and then scratch membership out of the title. The Russians seem to react more to the title than the actual substance. And so what I would argue is that Ukraine should decide what it needs to do and discuss with NATO what it needs to do to prepare itself for entry, and do that regardless of the name. The second point I would make about a membership action plan is, if it were to be announced, one doesn't exclude what the Russians might do. A membership action plan does not confer any kind of Article 5 guarantee on a prospective country. And if Ukraine were to get a membership action plan and Russia were to retaliate with military action against Ukraine, I'm not sure how NATO and you would react to that. Until there's a good answer to that question, I think we need to think a bit more carefully about this. On the summit meeting between President Biden and President Putin, I'm hoping that the President Biden does three things. The one thing should be to describe to President Putin the sorts of actions that the US government will consider unacceptable. Topping that list should be interference in American domestic politics, and actions which will be unacceptable and for which there will be consequences. Now, Mr. Putin is going to say, we don't interfere in your politics, we don't cyber hack. Don't get into an argument, but you just want to leave Mr. Putin with a sense that there are certain actions that the Russians have committed in the past, and if they continue in the future, there will be painful American consequences. And that seems to be what the Biden administration has suggested will be part of its approach towards Russia when it talks about holding the Kremlin to account for unacceptable actions. And I think that's the first point. The second point is that there are, I think, some narrow areas on which US and Russian interests appear to coincide. One would be arms control. So perhaps the two presidents can set in motion maybe strategic stability talks. My guess is a negotiating mandate is going to take a much longer period to work out. But then the third area would be, I think, questions that are going to be really hard questions. And I would put Ukraine on this point, where I hope that the president will reiterate continued strong American support for Ukraine, continued support for a solution to the conflict in Donbas in particular, and as later on for Crimea. But in the case of Donbas, and a solution that allows early restoration of Ukrainian sovereignty over all of Donbas. And then the third point should be to make clear that the responsibility for taking steps that would enable that kind of solution lie first and foremost in Moscow. Russia has to take the steps. Russia has to change its policy to enable a settlement in Donbas. And unfortunately, we haven't seen that happen over the past 7 years. Now, I fully expect Mr. Putin to come back and say, well, gee, we're not party to that conflict. And that would then be, I think, an appropriate time for Mr. Biden to tell Mr. Putin that, look, if we're going to have a working relationship, neither of us can treat the other one like an idiot. But I think Mr. Biden wants to leave Mr. Putin with a strong sense that if the Russians ever want to get back to something that looks more normal in US-Russia relations, the first and largest hindrance to that is Russia's ongoing conflict against Ukraine.
Steve, I think you're the only one on the panel that can answer this fully frankly, but a lot of people have said that it was a mistake on Biden's part to even offer this summit at this early point. What's your view on that?
I guess I disagree. I mean, I think as long as he handles the summit in the right way, I think it can be useful. It will be useful for Putin to hear directly from the American president. These are the sorts of things that we're not going to accept, that we consider unacceptable behavior, and for which there will be retaliation. I think that's a useful reinforcement if it's done person to person. I have to confess, I was surprised in April at height of tensions when you had this large Russian buildup around Ukraine, a buildup that has only been partially reduced in the last month and a half. But I thought it was interesting and surprised people that President Biden made that suggestion. And my guess is President Putin in particular was surprised. But I wonder if this was actually not something a little bit clever, and Deputy Assistant Secretary Kent may be in a position to confirm or neither confirm or deny this. But it seems to me that at that time, putting the offer of a meeting with President Biden on the table with the Russians perhaps was a step to help restrain the Russians. Because regardless of how coy the Kremlin was after President Biden offered the meeting, Vladimir Putin really, really, really wanted to meet. I mean, that's important, if for no other reason, for Mr. Putin's sense of Russia's place in the world and his place in the world. And so to some extent, I think President Biden, by offering the summit in the summer, created a hostage which he could shoot if the Russians, in fact, carried out a military incursion into Ukraine. Now, that's one way I interpret it as a possibility. I'll turn to George to explain the government's rationalization behind it.
I think President Biden can speak for himself and will do so on Wednesday. So I will leave it to the president himself when he does a solo press availability after the meeting. Just to talk again, those of us, some of the people listening here may not have gone online and seen the very extensive 79 paragraph NATO joint statement. There's a lot in there. For those that are focused on Ukraine in particular, I'll give you some numbers you can scan through what is an incredibly long and complex document. Paragraph 14 talks about many of the issues we talked about in the panel today about territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine, as well as Georgia and Moldova, three countries grouped together. Paragraph 59 talks about energy security and the importance thereof, which we've talked about today. There is some interesting information in paragraph 63 on partnership, which Ukraine is a partner. Paragraph 66, reaffirming the open door policy, and very specifically a long paragraph in 69 on Ukraine, including reaffirmation of the promises made in Bucharest in 2008. And so the language in this year's NATO declaration vis-a-vis Ukraine is actually stronger and more supportive than the previous statement in 2018. There's a lot there to digest. I'm not going to even read because it would probably take me 5 minutes just to read the language on Ukraine in the statement. But I would encourage all of you who are interested in this topic to check it out. It's been posted about 2 hours ago. Back over to the group.
Okay, thank you. We only have a couple more minutes left in our event. So I would like to turn the floor back to the ambassador and the first deputy minister. If you've got any final comments that you'd like to make about any of the issues that we've raised so far today, Ambassador?
Thank you. I think the most important thing for all of us to understand that the majority of these issues are very complex, and they just require everyday hard work in the right direction. So whether we speak about the internal transformation in Ukraine, whether we speak about the peace process in Donetsk and Lugansk, whether we speak about the Crimean platform and returning Crimea back, or anything else, we just need to have, the plan and be strong together working towards them. Because again, we briefly touched upon the Nord Stream 2 today and other subjects, but I think it's just one of the examples how Russia would like to divide everyone who believe in the same common democratic values, and to make it somehow the questions or the issues between us, when in fact there is only one aggressor around the table. So I think the more open and the more united the democratic world together with Ukraine on all of these issues, and the more we work together on all of them, the faster we will come to a place when we as Ukraine also could start our new page with Russia, but when they're out of our country, and when just as another neighbor, we can start building our new history with our neighbor, not with the aggressor who's still on our territory, attacking us from the outside and from within.
Thank
I
you.
will- Yes, just a small reflection. In a couple of months, 24th of August, we will celebrate 30th anniversary of our independence, but actually our statehood is much more ancient. And the historical context is super important if we want to understand what Ukraine is and what Russia is with regards to this falsification of the history and the narrative about Ukraine that Russia has been traditionally trying to deliver to the whole world, speaking about Ukraine. So if you look to my country at the moment, we are going through the global reconstruction. Every dimension of our life, be it education, healthcare, anti-corruption system, energy, everything is under reform. And of course, I openly say that we are learning to fly with cracked wings. And of course, as a society, as a post-genocide society, as a nation that lived through genocides, wars, intimidations, persecutions, and other challenges, of course, we need some time for resilience. And I'm very thankful that on this path, we do have allies, and the United States are among those allies, supporting and having unwavering support to the territorial integrity and sovereignty, providing military assistance, really assisting in the reform track. And I think it's always much more easier to fly, even with the cracked wings, but knowing that we are not alone in this process. Thank you.
Okay, with that, I would like to thank all of our panelists for a very stimulating discussion today. I'd like to thank the Embassy of Ukraine in the United States for partnering with us to bring about this event. And I'd like to thank all of you who participated online as listeners. So with that, we will conclude, and we will hope for freedom for these political prisoners, ultimately, that are being held by Russia in Ukraine. And we will not forget the basic injustice that was done both to them and to Crimea as a whole. So with that, thanks to all of you, and good evening.
Thank you, and Crimea's Ukraine.
Thank you so much. Sahuls. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Thank you.